Welcome to the Dance Research Q&A panel discussion. My name's Sutton Anker. I'm the IADMS Program and Marketing Specialist. I'm going to go over a few housekeeping notes before we begin. This panel is being recorded and will be shared to IADMS members via the mobile app. We ask that you please remain muted and keep your cameras off so the presenters can remain on the main screen for the recording. If you have any questions, further questions that need to be submitted or any additional comments, please feel free to submit those in the chat box throughout the conversation. IADMS would like to thank all of their supporters for the contribution to IADMS and to the iConference. So without further ado, I would like to now introduce the moderator of the Q&A panel discussion, Dr. Nancy Kadel. She is the president-elect of IADMS. Nancy is an orthopedic surgeon specializing in foot and ankle reconstruction. She studied dance and science at Sarah Lawrence College in the US, was a scholarship student at Jacobs Pillow, and performed with several dance companies. She graduated from the University of Washington School of Medicine in Seattle, fulfilled her residency training in Boston at the Harvard Orthopedic Program, and completed a foot and ankle fellowship at the New England Baptist Hospital. She has taught ballet and modern dance classes, and she has choreographed several works. So Nancy, the floor is yours. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Sutton, and I want to welcome everyone today to the Dance Research Q&A, and thank all of you that have submitted questions. I'll be asking the questions in the order that the presentations appear on the program. So first, we'd like to start with context, complexity, bias, and philosophy in performance medicine. Carolini, I'll ask you the first question. What an inspiring and creative PowerPoint. 500 words won't be sufficient to elaborate thoughts and reflections. Totally endorse this notion of complex worlds and systems. And as a psychologist, it is what we're trying to better understand in clients through the concept of formulation. Learning to let go of our human need to be in control lead HP and clients to resort to a reductionist answer. How would you start this journey of opportunities?
Thank you, Nancy. I would introduce myself a little bit. I am Caroline Bolling. I'm a sports physiotherapist from Brazil. Now I live in Netherlands. And I work in two sides. I am a clinician and I work as a physiotherapist. I used to work as a head therapist in Cirque du Soleil. And I'm also a researcher in the IOC Research Center here in Amsterdam. And going to my answer, I think there is one point, one of the titles that has in my talk, it's about the philosophy. And I love to philosophize about stuff. You probably figured this out with my talk. But I think that it's not just about the reductionist view, but also the paradigm that we use when we do research. When we don't talk about the complexity, we usually will think in a positivistic approach. So it's that approach that we want to test a hypothesis, and then we want to find that unique and only truth. And that's how we usually do in many quantitative and quite linear ways to work in our research. I think one step that we can think about when I talk about all the ontological and epistemological implications that we have when we accept complexity, one of them is that just the positivistic approach that, okay, I have a hypothesis, I test, and if it's yes or no, then it's my absolute truth. That's something that it comes with accepting complexity. So how can we in some way put this in practice? I think the first point, it's one of the end of that I put in the end of my presentation, that it's undress our certainty. We are used to do that because it's exactly the type of paradigm that we have in our way to do research. Nothing wrong with that. I think there is other question about that. I will let this for later. But I feel that the main idea that we have in this case is to try to be open for other truths that we might not be clearly investigating. So that when the questions say our human need to be in control, it's also our human need to be right. And I think that goes to our kind of positivistic approach that doesn't fit the idea to complexity.
Great. So let's go to the second question. Another one. Thank you for the excellent and inspiring presentation. The biomechanical model biotensegrity is also said to be a model of complexity and was developed by the orthopedic surgeon Stephen M. Levine as he tried to fathom how dancers could rise on point. Have you investigated this nonlinear model of complexity in your approach to treating dancers, and if so, how? Thank you.
Well, tensegrity. It's something that, well, of course, I am a physiotherapist. When I treat a dancer, any artist, any athlete, this is something that it's always behind like my mind, and I would keep on mind. The way that in general dancers will in some way adapt and compensate, and how the system itself reorganize, and when it's totally related with the idea of complexity. So the idea of biotensegrity, it's exactly that moment that it's a good example for us to understand how the system reorganize, self-organize, create their own ways to still be able to finish a task. I remember when I studied motor control, we learned, oh, this is a compensation. But by the end, it's just a system trying to complete a task. I want to do that. And if I cannot find this way, I find another way, and I find another way. We as physiotherapists, sometimes we think, oh, this is a compensation. That's not how it's supposed to do. No, the truth is, for the system as it is right now, that's the best way that they can find to do that. If you want to change that, we also need to find ways to change the system itself. So if I try to imagine in my practice how I think about biotensegrity, would be like this. So if there is something that in some way make that system unstable, and that was an emergent pattern in that system to reorganize and be able to conduct a task, then I need to find new ways or new interactions that I can create in that system to give the chance to the system to create a new alternative that might be, for instance, a better solution based on what I know regarding their motor behavior, for instance. Saying that, I must say that there is many complex systems inside complex systems. So we can say, oh, the biotensegrity, it's also a complex. But if we think about society, and when we talk about social factors, society, it's a huge complex system, also dynamic, organic. So we cannot separate all they will all be moving, and that's like how crazy and how busy it can be if we really accept complexity. It's not just one complexity system there. It's many that are in the same way operating and changing and emerging. So it's many things.
All right, last question. I agree with you, injury is multifactorial, complex, and I don't think we'll ever be able to predict it. I would even say that spending money and time on prediction is potentially a waste of resources and potentially missing the complex point. The opposite of complexity is simplicity, but I'm wondering if simplicity can complement complexity instead of oppose it. I wonder if interdisciplinary simplicity can create a path to deal with complexity.
Fully agree. Thanks, Nico. Yeah, I feel that sometimes when we talk about complexity and that everything needs to be in some way we need to look to something in the big picture. It sounds like, okay, so me studying the physiology or the biomechanics or the psychology, it means that I'm not taking into consideration complexity? No, not at all. Complexity is something that doesn't deny the simplicity, and simple solutions can change complex systems in a huge way. So it's not that, oh, if we want to change a complex system, we need a complex intervention. No. What I think is, if we, and was the main call that I have in the end of my talk, was like, we need to start to integrate our knowledges. What we know from psychology, what we know, like where we interact, and in some way, we can be talking about the same thing, and maybe what you have interact with a finding that I have, and then we can find where it's those links, because that's how an injury happened by the end. We know that, okay, that dancer was in that day, well, they have a bad turnout that comes too much, not from the hip, whatever, and then there is also not enough strength, and there was fatigue. But let's say that that day they broke up with the boyfriend, the girlfriend, or there was something that upset them and they didn't sleep well. So it's like all that, many factors that in that moment might be playing a role. And the complexity, exactly the idea of it's temporal. So it can happen the same thing every time, but if one day there is interaction between one and the other, then we have a specific outcome. So the simplicity or the interdisciplinarity that we can find in the simplicity of each discipline, it's not a problem at all. We are in the right track. I think what we are missing is when we are working in silos and we don't have a time to really interact, share, and then find out where are the links that we can in some way beneficiate what I know and what you know. So it's the interaction of any complex system should be also in the interaction of our knowledge.
Great, thank you. I think that wraps it up for your presentation. And now let's move to the next presentation, epidemiological headaches. So Everett, if you can introduce yourself, and then I'll ask you the first question.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me on this panel as well, and this version of IADMS. Let me hold this a little bit. It's a great pleasure. My name is Evert Verhagen. I'm from Amsterdam University Medical Center in Amsterdam, where we do a bunch of research on injury prevention. That's as concise as I can be.
Okay, great. Now, your first question is, thank you, Professor. It's been shown in research studies with dancers that compliance rate is over 85%. With such a willing cohort, as dancers by training are taught to obey or follow, often without question, does the dance science field need to be cautious and uphold ethical practices in terms of data collection, data sovereignty, and explicit informed consent? How can we as a community ensure that?
It's a good question. And I think you should be lucky dancers are so compliant. This is the main thing we struggle with athletes. They are non-compliant whatsoever. So count yourself lucky with that one. But of course, you need to uphold ethical practices. And this is not just a dance medicine issue. This is an issue that is in many, many fields. Also because nowadays it's so easy to get a data through objective measures, through objective watches, whatever. Subjective, you can get a lot of data as well. And on top of that, there's also a lot of clinical experts stepping up to become researchers. And that's great. Because let's be honest, I'm a researcher. I don't see patients. I don't do clinic. I'm not a clinical expert. But from my research perspective, I'm trying to find answers for your clinical questions. And I fail to do so. So I give you general answers to a specific question you may have. And you need to adapt that to your practice. And you struggle with that. So I think it's a really good development that there's a lot of people from clinical expertise, with a clinical expertise background, stepping up and becoming researchers, especially also because there's a lot of data available. But there's the pitfalls, the ethical issues. You have all the data available, but that data was never guarded for research purposes. So that is something. You can't use the data for research purposes. You need to have informed consent. You can't ask that afterwards. You can't say, hey, I have your data, can I use that for research? You need to ask it up front. This is what I want to do. This is the data I want to gather for that. Can I do that? And that's something we fail to forget sometimes. We solve that in our Olympic athletes, for instance, by saying, okay, we have a monitoring system. This is to support you in your medical services, but on an anonymized level, we want to use your data for research purposes too. And they need to tick the box before they even start to send one form back. You can do that in practice as well when a new dancer or a new artist comes into your group. And then there's also laws and regulations on how to handle and store data. And those are even country specific, region specific. So you need to be aware of those. So then maybe the real question of this question was, how can we as a community ensure that we uphold these ethical practices? I think there's a big role there for IADMS, to be honest. There could be support in terms of education around ethical principles and ethical considerations specific for dance, and maybe even provide specific guidelines towards ethical dance research. And that could be a good start in bringing the community a step further and get it into the minds of researchers.
Great. Let's go with question 2. Thank you for a thought-provoking PowerPoint. How would you start this process of asking the right questions and challenging current publication submissions with relevance given to negative results?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And I think here also we'll refer to the presentation of Matt Wyan, who will get some answers thrown at him later in the session. He also calls for a stronger scientific foundation in dance research. And he states that students and also researchers are incentivized to not just conduct novel research because it gets published easier, right? It's not the way to go. For me personally, and I hope for many other people out there, science needs to be about curiosity, about finding explanations, about understanding. And I see many questions in sports medicine, that is my main background, and probably also in dance medicine, where these questions are being asked not to understand something, but to prove something. And that's a pitfall, especially if there's a lot of clinical researchers doing research, because they have their pearls, or they have their good practices, and you want to prove them in a sound study. So then you don't find a positive outcome of your study. Then what? Does that disprove that your practical question didn't work? No, it just proves that there's no effect. So absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and that's something we tend to forget. There's also kind of a philosophical background to this. Most of the research we do is based on the philosophy of Karl Popper, critical rationalism. And we're still doing a lot of rational research, but we have forgotten the critical part of it. And here again, I would go back to education. I think that's where we need to start, is proper education, developing proper incentives, instead of going to academic impact factors, have KPIs based on societal impact factors. How much do our outcomes actually affect the dancers in a positive way? And that's not something we researchers or you clinicians or the mix can do alone. That is something the field needs to do. And I do see positive effects there. So I think if you ask me this question in 5 years again, I think we made some considerable positive steps here, definitely.
Thanks, Evert. I know that's true for medicine. Definitely in the last 20 years, outcome studies have come more to the front. And I think that that's rather just whether something works or not, but really what the outcome is on society. So I think that's helpful. We only have about 1 minute. If you can possibly briefly answer this last question. It said, brilliant presentation and greatly appreciated. How do you account for increased risk factors due to increased performance, due to increased injury prevention programs with your current perspective? You may not have time.
Yeah, quickly. The easy answer is monitoring. It's about nominator and denominator. So if you make sure dancers can stay dancing, their risk exposure goes up, they have more hours of dancing, you expect the number of injuries to go up too. But if those two are in line, your risk remains the same. It is when the risk doesn't remain the same, you have a discrepancy there. And the only way to follow that up is monitoring health of dancers over time. And the IOC recently published recommendations based on the latest epidemiological insights. Now I start to talk fast. And these can be translated to a dance realm. And then you have proper guidelines on how to monitor. And if you do that across the board in a similar, valid, reliable way, within no time, you have a lot of data that you can track over time and you can jump in when needed. Monitoring is the answer here.
Wonderful. Thank you. That was really helpful. And now we're going to switch over next to Margaret Wilson, and we're going to discuss adapting research tools for addressing complex movement in dance, encouraging multidisciplinary engagement in research questions. So I'll let you introduce yourself and then I'll ask you your first question, Margaret.
All right. It's lovely to see so many of you. I am Margaret Wilson. I'm at the University of Wyoming where I teach dance and I do dance research, and I also mentor undergraduate dance science researchers.
Great. So here's your first question. You discussed the gold standard as validity, reliability, sensitivity. When working with students or your researchers, which of these standards do you are most often missed or oversighted, and how do you bring students back on track to meet these three standards?
So it's a great question. Sometimes I think I miss all of them. I think my goal as an educator with the dance students is to try and get them to simplify. I loved Carolini's reference to that, because our students have lofty goals for what they want to do in their dance research. And I think my task, my responsibility is to help them sort of find what the core of their question is. So if they're looking at jumping, you know, there are lots of things that they could be researching in jumping, and yet what is the sort of the irreducible element of jumping that they can begin to look at in their questions. So helping them develop a sense of accuracy, of consistency in their measure is, I think, the goal that I have for myself. And what ends up happening is I feel like the students end up trying to narrow their focus, not in a way to eliminate other possibilities, but to give them a starting point to look. And I think that's the key for me, is trying to help them identify a variable, whether it's a criterion variable or a training variable, that they actually can look at and begin to evaluate or measure. I thought about subtitling my presentation 101 Uses of the SEBT. And that could be my life's legacy. But I think that's why I like the SEBT, is that it has, we're not using it in the way it was designed, and yet the design of the test allows for much more clarity in the question that you're asking. So can they reach to a certain point? Can they increase their range by training? Is it a measure of conditioning? Can it be used to measure balance? Can it be used to help identify kinematic weaknesses in the body? So to answer the question, I think the struggle is always, how can we redefine our question to make it something that we can begin to address? And I often quote Matt Wyan in terms of the importance of maybe going back to something that's been done before and repeating a test, because the population I'm working with are young researchers, and I'm trying to help them understand the process of research through perhaps replicating something that someone has done before. And I've had very successful students go through something and really evaluate a protocol, and then they may end up modifying it by simplifying it or making it more appropriate to the population that they're working with. But I think that in a nascent field, and I feel like dance science is still in a nascent stage, we do ourselves justice by maybe reworking the tools that we have and reinvestigating the tools and making them work for us, because we have a very unique population.
Well, thank you. I think some of that may be answering this next question, but what do you think is the best approach to make this possible in the various research settings? What is the largest setback for this not to occur? And how can we as researchers foster this approach?
I think others will answer this question for me as well. I think the two previous presenters, you know, our goal is not to prove something, but to further investigate something. And as we are asking questions, thinking about tools that have worked for us in the past, may be a stepping stone, but at some point it also will be a limitation. I think there are other questions that the SEBT can't address, particularly balance. I think it has not been able to address balance for dancers, because dancers have very sophisticated strategies. Glenna Batson found that Frances Clark, who successfully defended her or had her PhD thesis accepted, today? That's so exciting. You know, she struggled with finding lots of tests to look at dancers' balance. Dancers' balance is very complex, so using a simple tool may not be the best for that. I guess the other way I interpreted the question was, you know, how do we create a group of people around research? And, you know, does that open us up to more questions or more answers? And so I think my goal is to help my students learn how to ask the questions and to guide them in a way to tools that may be helpful to them, and yet also help them understand the limitations of using those. So I think it's an ongoing journey.
So Margaret, I know we only have about 45 seconds for you, but an additional question just came in, and it's very interesting. Oh. I thought you might want to answer it. You mentioned somatics. Has the YBT or the SEBT research looked at the influence of imagery or visualization in regards to the test?
So I believe there was a researcher at Laban who worked with Glenna Batson who did use imagery. Her name is escaping me at the moment, but I think that's another component that could be added to a very simple task that, you know, could have other applications. But from my perspective, I was able to work with a somatic movement educator last spring in our screenings, and she was able to look at places where there was inefficiency in the body in terms of too much holding or not enough release. And so it gave me a different perspective as well.
Great. Well, thank you so much. We have to move on now. So next, yes. We're going, but I appreciate all your answers. Thank you. So next we're going to move to Matthew Wyan, and we'll be discussing, are we building on poor foundations? Science needs a strong footing. So Matthew, could you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, I'm Matthew Wyan. I'm an exercise physiologist, a research professor at the University of Wolverhampton. And yeah, I think that's about it. And I just do research.
Great. Thank you, Professor. So here's your first question. Thank you for this important and clear presentation. Do you think we will ever be able to truly represent the variability in the physiological demands of and individual response to dance, given the huge diversity within and between genres and in different practices, for example, rehearsal versus performance? Will our research ever have a high degree of generalizability?
In a nutshell, you won't know until we find out. But one of the issues I have slightly is when we call dance, and we try and lump everything together. And you know, when we often, I'm a bit the same as ever since that I do sport and dance. From a sporting background, is we look at the disciplines differently. We don't expect the disciplines to be the same. We have different tests for different events and activities in sport. But at the moment in dance, we just bung it all together. And so we need to look at those and say, and separate them out into their genres and look at them all individually and say, okay, we've done ballet stuff, we've done some modern, we're doing a bit of hip hop and street now. But there's so many genres we haven't looked at. So we don't even know if there is conformity or homogeneity between them, or if there is diversity. We don't know this, but no one's examining it. And this is a thing we've got to start looking to do. Way back in the dark ages of, the 80s, some of you might remember, others don't. Some of them obviously weren't born. When Shantz and Astran and Cohen did all their stuff, they did really limited research, and our equipment now has gone on. And so we can actually do some really good stuff and answer this whole thing is why and how and what's going on sort of thing. And this is one of the big limitations, I think, is we're basing our, and this comes down to this need for replication and repeatability of stuff. One study isn't good enough. We need to have 10, 15 studies looking at the same, using a similar methodology to find out if there is even differences between countries. Now, if we look even between the UK and the continent over in the rest of Europe, modern or contemporary dance is totally different. And so therefore, is there actually a difference then in those demands of it? And we just need to find out, let's go on to the rest of it. Yeah. And in different practices, we need to look at class, different styles of dance class, rehearsals, performance. The reason why I looked at that initially was I was interested to see where was that physiological cardiorespiratory adaptation coming on to prepare the dancers for training, for performing. And we found that actually it wasn't there in their training practices. Now, again, in sport, we've separated the two, and this is what obviously Chatfield and Krasnow suggested sometime in the 90s, mid-90s, I think it was, off the top of my head. And they were looking at, don't try and adapt the technique class or the rehearsal to cause a physiological adaptation. Do that outside. And that's what we see in sport. We have skills training and we have fitness training. And that was the main point of that, is saying, okay, have we got issues there? And I found out, okay, we have an issue. How do I look at then trying to solve that issue? And, and that's where Manuela's PhD and Emily Twitchett's PhD sort of started that thing of looking at how do we do interventions to help dancers dance better or dance longer or reduce potentially one of the risk factors of getting injured when they say it's fatigue and overwork. I think that's about that in summary, but yeah.
Well, we have more questions for you. So the next one is, thank you, Matthew, for an insightful PowerPoint. It's in a couple of parts. So question one, could we look at influencing editors and reviewers in including at least 1 or 2 replicated studies within their publications, or at least aiming for that? And then the second part, I'm aware that it depends on the quality and variety of submissions. Any further comments on how we can promote what you have eloquently and courageously done in your own paper?
That's always the golden thing, isn't it? And, there's a lot of issues, as has been said before, about the publishing process at the moment, and editors want sexy papers, so other people cite them and their impact factor goes up, and it's a sort of never-ending process of trying to find the latest and keep on the curve, so to speak, and sort of pushing those sort of things. And again, this comes down to the fact that they don't like publishing no results or no effect. They want to see significant effects. They want to see, oh, this is really exciting, rather than actually, this is interesting because it's actually shut a door, or it's actually disproved this whole line of research. And that's really important. And how can we influence journal editors and reviewers? It's difficult, but we have 2 main sort of journals. MPPA and obviously our own JDMS. And hopefully within that, we can start looking at promoting this need for replication. I have to admit, though, actually, I did submit a replicated study a while back, and one of the reviewers said, "Why have you done this? Because it's already been done before." And I actually ended up replying to them about the importance of replication within science. But this again comes down to education, and it is that education of editors and reviewers that replication is essential. Our foundations are really dodgy.
Well, we're still in our infancy, as Margaret said. So I think that we have room to grow in that regard. But I agree, like all the presenters, that really it's education of our community, but also that will filter into educating the reviewers and the editors. So the last question we have on this presentation is, there's a growing push for students, particularly graduate students, for thesis and dissertation projects to only do innovative research instead of replication research in order to ensure publication, which is often a requirement for graduation. How would you address this problem to encourage more students to conduct foundational replication research while understanding that it might be harder to gain publication upon completion? It's a bit what you've already mentioned, but.
Yeah, so I would say, so to get a PhD or a doctorate, you need to at least like add to the body of knowledge and be innovative or potentially innovative. Now, a replicated study is both of those. You've added to the body of knowledge because you've actually challenged something that's been done previously. And I can remember when I did my master's degree, we were advised and directed to replicate a previous study. And I think as well, even at the PhD level, and obviously we have different practices of how we do PhDs, from on the continent to maybe over in the States when, so using France's example, she had 4 or 5 studies in her PhD. That made up her whole PhD. So you could easily get 2 of those studies as replication. And one of my students at the moment has done this. So she's replicated the Fit to Dance survey we did over in the UK, but over in China. And so we've got this basis to see, are the Chinese injuries similar, or the report we got similar to the UK? And we're looking to do this again soon in Brazil. And we've done this in dance sports. So we're using that same methodology on different populations to try and find if there's any similarity or difference. And I think this again is down to the supervisors. And it's looking at how we direct and help students. We're all learning about research. None of us are, I would say, the completed product. We're all trying to learn and trying to find new ways of doing things. And part of that as well is making sure, as we make steps forward, that we know what we're standing on to make those steps.
Thank you. That's great. Well, because of time, let's move on now to e-learning in conservatoire dance training, challenges and possibilities. So Heidi, can you introduce yourself and I'll give you the first question.
Hello everyone, I'm Heidi Yu and I'm zooming in from Hong Kong. I'm dance science lecturer in the Academy for Performing Arts here. So yeah, this presentation, we talk about the e-learning. How does it work in Hong Kong last semester?
Great. So here's your question. Thank you for an informative e-learning presentation. So it's in 2 parts. Question 1, there is clearly a lot of thought and preparation that's gone on into the session, and certainly similar models in other genres have been applied as we adapt to this new reality. How do you deal with potential misalignments leading to injuries when students are practicing at home? That's the first question.
So I think we were kind of thrown into it in the beginning. Like everyone else was like kind of following one country after next. That was very not looking happy for the dance world, as we're very physical and very close culture in terms of teaching and learning. we quickly divided the students into 3 groups. We had a big group of year 1, which this course is delivered to. So 40-some students, we stopped doing it with one teachers only. We split them into 3 groups. So over the Zoom like 2 windows, we could see them better. That was the most straightforward reason. And we try to show different planes of movement, so you don't have mirror and then they can't see your 3D anymore. So both the teachers and students were asked to change their either the laptop or themselves turn around a bit so we could check on the alignment. And there's one thing that we did in the after Zoom session. It's like the asynchronous session. So they often have tasks they need to film themselves, and we will see if they're doing the right thing or not. I think the most important thing is not to replicate what we do in the studio online, because that's just doesn't work that way. We're learning from a different platform through a different media. So probably we try to work on what is effective rather than explosive movement or kick their legs up to the head. Those can wait until face-to-face training, but there are a lot of other things that we can work on. So yeah, yes, that's all.
So question 2 is, I really liked the quiz. No right or wrong answer, but pedagogically checking the students' learning. Do you have an evaluation feedback from across the students?
We did thought about it because we want to know how do they feel, and then if they give us feedback, we can modify our teaching method. However, there's a big responsibility if we really do surveys, like how do we deal with the data and stuff. But switching to e-learning was busy enough for us, so we couldn't do it in the last semester. We're learning, we're changing, but we did get some informal feedback. So this semester we have made some changes. So we don't do exact same duration as we would in the classroom. Let's say it's a 2-hour bodywork class. You can't really do 2-hour Zoom meeting. Everyone just don't like it. they don't say it, but you could tell they don't like it. Their faces just gone, or some just turn their camera off. So you can't really replicate it synchronously. You could give them asynchronous homework, but it just doesn't work the same duration. So we control the meeting hour, we give them break, we give them breakout rooms. We use that a lot now in this semester. So we're hoping to do a more comprehensive questionnaire or survey or focus group interview. Yeah, so if other schools are planning to do so, like research on how e-learning in Down schools, we're happy to hear your advice. If you're also doing survey or research, we could talk about like what kind of questions we should include and see if we could generate some interesting finding together.
Well, great, thank you. We look forward to hearing more as this progresses. So let's go quickly to Elizabeth. This was from the student committee, how to identify quality research. So if you could introduce yourself, I'll ask your question.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Yutzi, and I am the chair of the IADMS Student Committee, and I'm representing all of the committee members who contributed to this presentation. I have an MFA in Dance Science from Trinity Laban, and I'm currently at Drexel University College of Nursing and Health Professions in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
Great. So here's your question. Thank you for this excellent presentation. Would you consider creating a written resource of some kind for students to be able to widely access?
Great, thank you. I have a very simple answer. Yes, we would consider this. I think we would love to, first and foremost, find a way to get out all the resources that we mentioned. So we have a list of different checklists that you can use, such as the Prisma checklist, Consort checklist, that you can use to appraise your research. And we would love to get that out, that list to students. And we would definitely look into translating our presentation into a more concise document. There are some great tips from the research committee and from the student committee as well that kind of would help get your appraisal process kickstarted. So yes, thank you for that suggestion.
Well, we look forward to it because there were so many useful things in your presentation. I'm sure that having that as one document would be really helpful for students going forward. So thank you. So we'll go back now to Matthew for our last presentation. And we'll take another 5 to 10 minutes on this, and then we'll go into the networking session. So this paper was, what is competency within dance, medicine, and science? How can this be recognized across countries and professions? So Matthew, the first question, and this was a group panel that you guys put this together. So the first question is, as many professional bodies already have their own accreditation process, would a better way not be to harness and work in tandem with these? Rather than reach out to members, reach out to the organizations. For example, PASIG for physical therapists, NSCA for sport and conditioning. One of the key points, if we have a generic accreditation, is to ensure the breadth of knowledge of an IADMS, quote, validated practitioner, i.e. has a solid understanding of all the disciplines involved in our organization and how they input collectively.
Okay, so this is part of the survey that the Professional and Development Committee put forward, and you know, and as they said here, yes, there's a load of national organisations, and the slight difference is that we are an international organisation as well, and we're not saying we're poo-pooing any other organisation on a national level, but we wanted to provide something for our members. So we've got members who've got a serious lot of expertise, and we're trying to work out a way of getting IADMS to be able to recognise that expertise and provide that recognition through accreditation. And yes, we are, and within that sort of process is that we would maybe say if somebody's done their accreditation through the performing arts special interest group, that's great, and we could maybe use that as a recognition, say maybe for those in the States, but it's a US based interest group. Just as the NSCA or the UK SCA, you know, are both strength and conditioning qualifications that require quite generic skills. What we would look for within ours is specific ability to work with dancers. And so we'd maybe say, if somebody wanted to say, I want to become an accredited strength and conditioning person, say, right, you've got to have one of these basic qualifications, and then you might need to submit a case study of how you've worked with a dancer to use testing and intervention to help them, and or working with other disciplines as well to get them from A to B in either their training enhancement or in their rehab. And so that's really the process, and is to provide our members something which we can recognise as well. So if you've got a dancer you're working with in one city who's then going to another country, we'll be able to find somebody through our accreditation who we know is competent with working with dancers. And that's the aim of it. We're not trying to supersede others or say we're better than, but we will look at recognition of different countries' qualifications as well within this. And so we've split them up to different areas where we've seen there's differences, and sometimes it's US, rest of the world differences, sometimes there's differences in Eurasia and Europe. So we're trying to find those sort of differences in qualifications and recognize that, and recognize that person's ability to operate within their region. Or the other bit, sorry, the better bit. I was interested about the generic accreditation, to say you understand all disciplines, and I think that's essential to be a good practitioner. We need to understand what the different disciplines offer, and the reason why I got into dance, medicine and science is I once read an article on strength training written by a physio, And I said, listen, that's not right. I said, get a physio to help rehab, but find a physiologist or an S&C person to actually do the strength and conditioning. I said, there's two different training here and two different ways of approaching it. And so I think what we need to look is for people to understand where their role fits in with the multidisciplinary team, but also to be an expert within their discipline.
I like that clarification at the end there. That's helpful, I think. And so the last question we had for you is this. As recognized meeting different country requirements can be a challenge, a range of, quote, practitioner psychologists, unquote, may be working in dance, either in schools or in companies. And for the UK, it may be important to make the distinction and the legal requirement of protected title through HCPC registration.
Yeah, so that again comes down to the fact is we've got why we put out this survey is to find out what every country's legal and requirements are to actually operate in there. Yes, an HSPC in the UK is something which is a clinical psychologist needs to be registered with before they can practice. And so that would be that fundamental requirement for working in the UK as a hopefully eventually accredited psychologist. And so that's the idea, is to recognize each of those. And the more information we can have from each country's requirement, then we just build up a body of requirements for each discipline. And that's what we're trying to achieve. So it's going to be a nightmare. And it's going to be lots of different tick boxes, but we want to try and make sure that we cover all bases. And there are some generic aspects to it, and there's some things which are very specific to countries. As we've discovered on nutrition, which is very interesting, so that we found these differences. And so that's one of the things we're trying to do.
Wonderful. So do you guys have any plans to resubmit the survey again, or do you feel like you had enough responses?
Well, when people come back and say, "Oi, there's issues," that's what we would say. Tell us the issues, and then we can add to the knowledge that we've got. So we'll put stuff out. We've sent what we have at the moment to a group of experts, IADMS experts from different parts of the world. They're fed back to us. So at one point we need to say, here we go. And eventually somebody's going to say, oh, but what about me? I'm slightly weird and wonderful. And that is saying, okay, we recognize your weirdness and your wonderfulness. Tell us what's needed for your discipline, or what's needed in your country to actually work. And that's what we're after.
Well, wonderful. We look forward to as this grows and progresses. But I think right now we've reached our time for the question and answer period. So presenters, I would really like to thank you all for participating in our first ever virtual conference for IADMS, and for joining us today to discuss your presentations and your dance research. To all you attendees and viewers out there, thank you for joining us, and thank you so much for submitting these great questions. We encourage everyone to continue this conversation on the iConference mobile app, on the event feed, and through direct messaging to fellow attendees and presenters. IADMS would appreciate everyone to complete the iConference feedback survey. It's in the menu on the IADMS app. It only takes 5 to 10 minutes, and we really need your feedback from the survey. You can also rate the sessions on the mobile app, and don't forget that we'll have the next week, we'll have the interactive movement sessions, including a live Q&A discussion on Friday, October 16th at 1 p.m. GMT.